So Brian, loved your talk the other day. Really enjoyed the panel, Ashley and Adam. But Ashley and Adam, Brian is a bit of a shrinking violet, and you really didn't let him get a word in edgewise on the panel discussion. And I saw him desperately trying to get a word in. So
he promised us that he was the moderator.
Right. I think it was great. No, it was great. Terrific. I mean, obviously, look, the three of us, there is no moderator. That's the reality. They're the three of us.
There's no moderation that could happen.
You can't hold us down.
Exactly. No, it was great. Thank you very much for that. That was a lot of fun. And I do feel though it was short in that just as it was getting super spicy, or and we're out of time. Oh, come on, now we're getting interesting. But that was a lot of fun. So thank you both for where do we want to pick it up, Adam? Do we want to do you want to give a little bit of context here? Do
you want to give a little synopsis of your talk perhaps? And then there were actually a couple of topics that kind of tailed off towards the end that I was hoping that we could pick up.
Sure. So so my talk was I revisited a talk that I gave in 2012 on corporate open source anti-patterns when we learned that Ashley had baby Ashley dreams about what open source was. It was so long ago. Ashley, I love that. I love the way you phrased your younger, more optimistic self before we were all jaded. And but so in that talk, I was really focusing on. I mean, Oracle was the villain of that talk. That's let me just distill it down for you. It was Oracle-based villainy, and more not actually. Oracle has so much villainy that you actually got to be more specific than that. This is more like the large companies that were participating in open source poorly. In the kind of the Oracle's extreme, they were making things proprietary, but a lot of other companies just weren't really abiding by the social contract of open source. They weren't really giving back. And that's kind of what that was the theme in 2012. In 2023, that is not the theme. If Oracle was the villain in 2012, then just bluntly, HashiCorp was the villain in 2023, in part because they just embody so many anti-patterns.
Who saw that one coming, though?
Seriously.
Did not. Did you see that one coming? I did not see that one coming.
I didn't see it coming at all.
Heroku. The fate of Heroku, I feel like, was when the direction started going a bit sideways.
So Adam, when you say you mean Twitter. Hashi in itself, in particular, if we were good to go back into a time machine even a year ago and tell ourselves that Hashi's the villain, you'd be like, what? What happened? Is that what you meant?
Yeah. I wouldn't have predicted it. And there were a few people in my life who are smart in the know folks in the open source conversation who dropped hints that they were just wait till the big bomb drops,
Oh, really?
And I'd be like, you can't just say that shit to me. Give me the fucking gossip, I'm over here being a friend. You can tell me to keep it a secret. But they kept that shit locked down tight. But yeah, there were definitely rumors that I was not privy to, or they were briefings, could be briefings. But yeah, I would not have predicted it.
In fact, 3 months ago, Adam, I would have put them at last on the list there. I thought they were I kind of loved them. And I think that's what made this change all the more galling for me.
Yeah.
I think you're right, Adam. That's a really good point. Because I mean, God, it was when we had Kelsey on talking about it. It was so, and it just, Kelsey talking about hey, all the work I did for you back in the day, I didn't have to do any of that. And now I'm a chump for doing that work. I mean, I was just very, very evocative, and it was totally surprising. And I hope, I gotta say,
I just said, who do you think is next? Because certainly HashiCorp won't be the last.
Adam is now when we announce I shouldn't even joke.
My product hasn't even made it into the market really yet. I'm going to go business open source license.
Okay. I'm going to be optimistic. I am going to say that this is a turning point. This is just, so I know this may be ridiculous. I think that prior to Hashi, it felt like there were no consequences. And in part, there were no consequences because the buseling that was happening was actually lower key. It was tighter. I mean, you look at what, Adam, when you and I were blogging about what was happening in 2018 in Confluent and Cockroach, they look, I mean, we have so moved the Overton window that they seem like completely reasonable by comparison.
Totally.
And I think that so kind of with every act, there was this kind of like implicit escalation. Everyone using these other companies as the justification. Everybody's doing it. I'm just doing it a little bit more. Everyone's doing it. I'm doing a little bit more. And now I actually really wonder if we haven't hit the actually, this is too far and you're going to lose the whole kit and caboodle and serve as a warning to other. I know, but this is too optimistic, isn't it?
I know. It's I'm so glad this is recorded so that, 20 minutes from now, when someone switches their license, we can play it back.
I've had more than a few, let's call it a handful of conversations with people post HashiCorp's news being like, our board is asking us this question. Is this what is this what we should do? And not being demanded to switch by their board. Do you know what I mean? Their board's not showing up with a fiat, saying do this or you're in trouble or whatever. But just people asking the question, hey, this is a clear trend. All the big versions of what you hope to be someday are doing it. Should you be doing it too? Or are you missing a trick? And I don't, for every handful that talks to me, there's many handfuls that aren't, and even the ones who did talk to me, who knows what they'll do in the end, right? It's not like everybody listens to my advice and is like, oh my God, Adam Jacob, got to do that. So I don't know. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better.
I don't know. Your advice is usually very positive, I think, Adam. So I wouldn't sell yourself short.
I think I give good advice. I'm not saying it's bad advice. I think it's the right advice. But I don't know.
Not everyone's smart and not everyone follows it. That's fair.
But they may not follow it. Yeah.
So Brian, terrific talk. Really enjoyed it. And then a great panel that broke out. And I think the organizer was trying to give everyone the hook and everyone in the audience was asking them not to. This was great.
I didn't realize that until after the fact. I don't know if Adam and Ashley realized that. I did not realize that until after the fact. Do you realize that they gave us that they were trying to give us the hook earlier, and the P99 crowd demanded that they let us run longer?
No.
Yeah, it was pretty good.
Idea. That was
that's also why the end was so sudden, because they were like, no, I'm cutting to a commercial right now.
I'll admit, exactly. I assumed the end was always going to be sudden because we all knew that 20 minutes was just not enough.
Yeah, we weren't going to be done talking.
Well, it was now we can really stretch out. One of the topics that we ended on that I really want to pick back up is that someone, I really can't remember who it was, sort of pointed to the big co's from 10 years ago and big co's now and saying that their behavior was materially different and better and improved. And I think someone else taking the other side of that. So I don't know if that resonates or sounds familiar, but I'd love to hear what do people think of Microsoft, Meta, Amazon in terms of their participation in open source and how that's changed.
I mean, I think Brian was making the point. Go ahead, Ashley.
Oh, I think the thing I was going to say was this word rapaciousness that got repeated way too many times. But I think the thing that's really interesting that I think forks with that question that you were just saying is there was an element I feel like Brian was saying of that open source can be a guard on the greediness of corps.
Right. Yeah.
And I feel like Adam said the greediness came from the entrepreneurs in open source. And then I kind of was I think everyone who participates in open source has some level of greediness.
Yeah, I'm 100% actually
anyways,
on
I'll put that out there.
Yeah, I'm with you on the greedy side. I actually think I don't think that I think there's very little only there are individuals who hold I think really deep open source ethics and really believe in the movement and what it can do for humanity. I'd like to believe I'm one of those people. And then there's the reason to participate on an individual level, which tends in some larger way, which I think tends toward greed. And definitely if you look at Microsoft, Microsoft didn't have a conversion because they suddenly caught a case of morality. You know what I mean? They just what they saw was this potent weapon they could use to make a bunch of money and hurt their competitors, and they took it, and then it worked, and now they're oh, we should do that more.
Yeah, and I think that my argument would be that, and let's call it for the moment self-interest, even though we can acknowledge that it might be avarice. But that self-interest and you have entities like Microsoft that yes, Microsoft is not engaged in open source because it thinks it's good for humanity. It's because it realizes that it needs to do this for its own self-interest. And I think my argument would be that presence is very important, because the open source acts as a check on these companies, and that they behave even worse when they are strictly proprietary, because they have not just unlimited pricing power, but they effectively have a natural monopoly over their own customers, and they end up in this obscene relationship that and so this was I think Adam, you and I.
Let me add him.
Well, no, because I think people don't understand how ugly these. I mean, and actually, I guess we're not allowed to use the word rapacious. Do I have to have a synonym for rapacious? Because
I just thought it was very funny that we got stuck on such an illustrious word. It was just funny to me.
But the way in which these strictly proprietary companies handle themselves is so unspeakably gross, especially now. So it's like the in particular. So I actually, Adam, as I was reflecting on what you were saying, and kind of as we were talking about that in that panel, I've got a metric for you, and that is how often do you litigate against your own customers? And I think that this should be featured at, like, a public company should have to say how frequently they litigate against their own customers. And this is something that Oracle does all the time. This is something that Cadence does all the time. This is something that actually, and maybe Red Hat does do it all the time. They do.
And I did too.
Oh my
Chef
God.
did. Like, I had totally had to. If I didn't go to customers and be like, hey, you owe me more money, it's not like they were volunteering. You know what I mean? And yeah, I think I'm not sure that the level of litigation against their customers goes down. I think its tenor changes because the customer has an option that they maybe didn't otherwise have.
Yeah.
But the pursuit of the dollar, I think, is probably roughly the same. You know?
Yeah.
But
this gets me into my thought that, from the open source perspective, it hasn't changed it. It's just sublimated it. And I won't do any more psychoanalysis babble or anything. But the idea is that it's taken the same behavior pattern, but it's thrown a layer of abstraction on it. So it's slightly harder to point at, which actually kind of makes it more insidious. One of the words that you mentioned that really struck with me, and I was thinking about what I was going to talk on this panel today, and the thing that's stuck with me was that and maybe this is also my Roman Catholic upbringing, but open source is really what taught me that ambition is a sin, which is that the only way to get a monopoly now, I think, in tech in many ways, is to do open source and do what is functionally the standards grab. And so I think in many ways, I think that's what the CNCF does in many ways. But that's what I think it is. And I think it's just that it's become slightly more socially acceptable to take that path for now. And then once it isn't, there'll be a new layer of abstraction that we throw on top of it. But the same underlying motivations will remain.
So
which is kind of not the baby Ashley optimism.
So open source is kind of a way, it's a palate cleanser for world domination. That the world domination is actually acceptable in an open source vehicle. Is that a fair way?
That's right. It's like world domination with extra Care Bears.
Yeah, and the big co's have harnessed this to wrap their a lot of the same things that they were doing with this morality.
Oh, 100%.
If a competitor comes in, I drop my price to zero. The SEC is very interested in that. If instead I have this open source product that I'm giving away, it changes the tenor of that completely.
Totally.
Oh my
and
gosh,
if you look at
and that was the other thing, monopolies, but also the price fixing. Open source is price fixing at zero.
Yeah, totally. There's the Microsoft does this now. They launched a thing called Radius, which is a DevOps infrastructure as codey platformy tool. I don't think it's particularly interesting as technology, but that they did it, they launched it as an open source project. right? It clearly competes with a bunch of existing both open source and proprietary things, including things inside Microsoft's own house, right? And and it has like clear and obvious monetization hooks that lead you into Azure or other places. And they've figured out that, if that was a proprietary thing that they had launched, they would have looked like they were bullying people around in their own ecosystem. But, slap an open source license on it, say they're going to give it to the CNCF. Next thing you know, it's all good in the hood, right? Like we're all friends here, right? Sure. Friendly.
That's right. And they're pulling up the ladder, from other startups that might want to enter that space.
Oh, for sure.
Because all of a sudden I can throw 1,000 engineers working for zero revenue and just monetize it in these other products.
So is this, Adam, is this the 2023 equivalent of the vaporware announcements from the 90s? I mean, is that because Microsoft famously would do this? They would announce things that they didn't have to kill startups.
I think I don't think it's that bad. I think it's actually more innocent than that. I think it's literally Google does this all the time too. There's a good idea and then there's a googly take on that idea. And then they're like, obviously the googly take is a better one because it's Google, And I think Microsoft's the same. And then now there's a vehicle for getting those ideas to sort of to feel like they're wrapped in a giant Care Berry hug, which is we open sourced them and we gave them to a foundation, And it's the motivations for doing it are, I'm not sure how much they've changed, but they're wrapped in a layer of principle that makes them more palatable to everyone, right? And I'm not sure how principled they actually are most of the time.
I didn't know about this vaporware pattern. But I will certainly say that while I haven't seen companies necessarily do this, I have seen open source foundations release functionally nothing under the name of land grabbing it for collaboration so that it doesn't result in competition in the ecosystem. So I've seen that a lot, and that is definitely a way that they try to crush competition. That has definitely happened. I'm sure people.
Okay, so let me ask you this, Ashley, because that's really interesting. I would love to get the details. I would be very curious to know what fraction of them were the LF.
I can sort of gesture at Rust async.
Oh, interesting. Okay, let's.
I'm probably in huge trouble for saying that now, but there's definitely a big this is a pattern in Rust. In total, Rust kind of went. In many ways, I think everything is ebb and flow, and so they reacted really hard one way, and the idea of building something out in the ecosystem and not fully collaborating all on one thing that's the official thing is kind of seen as bad. And so early on, Rust even though it's not in the standard library is small or whatever, it did stake out a bunch of things and sit people as leads in those places to try and keep them from being ecosystem driven parts of the project.
And do you see foundations doing this with other kind of broader technologies? Is this part of a broader pattern, do you think? Because let me ask this, because the thing that
incubator programs and foundations, sometimes the foundations are not operationally efficient enough for me to assume that they're doing it in a strategic way, but sometimes it ends up having that impact anyways.
Right. Okay. Fair. And this is, I think, it's always a good idea to ascribe things to incompetence that you're tempted to ascribe to malice. So it's whoops, sorry, we accidentally did I kill this other community over here? Sorry about that. So one thing that is interesting about this kind of hashy thing is that it is increasingly clear that they are drawing a battle line against the LF, and that is going to be a weird narrative to unfold, because that's something we have not seen happen. We have not seen a company go to war with a foundation. And first of all, do you see the same thing? And because one question I definitely have for you both is what the anti-patterns are going to be sort of like, what are we going to come back a decade from now and talk about with respect to the new anti-patterns? Actually, maybe we'll say that to the end. I should not. I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves here.
It's a pretty good question. I'm totally here for. I don't. This is my personal opinion, which I'm sure is going to get me in trouble in some future point in my life. But I think in general, the Linux Foundation and the CNCF more specifically, I don't think that they've always been great actors for the entirety of their ecosystem. I think that they are great actors for the people who pay them the most, and they're incredible vehicles for funneling the hopes and dreams of those large organizations into collaboration in software, which is great or whatever. That, like, in many ways it's great. But like, I wouldn't say that they're like necessarily positive actors in a lot of cases. And I think, if you're HashiCorp, I think the problem with HashiCorp was deeper than HashiCorp talks about. I think the shape of their business and its inefficiency is for real. And I have an anti-pattern that I will declare there, that I think that whole model of building open core companies is like broken, and sort of irretrievably so, perhaps.
Can we talk about that? Is now the time to talk about that? Because that is something you mentioned in the panel. I think that is a really important point, and it kind of gets to this advice, because Adam, you're talking about people reach out to me for advice and they kind of ignore it. What kind of questions are they asking you? Because I imagine people are asking you, hey, I've got this open source project, it's pretty popular, I'm thinking about this open core model. What do you, Adam, Jacob, think about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, what I get a lot of is just, we have this thing, how do we think about open source in relationship to our business? What's the right model to think about it? I try not to like be a pedant about the fact that open source isn't a business model, yada, yada, yada. So with that out of the way, we'll just call them business models because it's easier. I think what I see and have seen more and more of, and becoming more and more convinced of, is that we essentially think about open source as a vehicle for setting the product price, the acquisition cost of the product, to zero, which is basically what open core does. So you give away a ton of value for nothing. And then you create some barrier artificially somewhere else, upon which some segment of the market will want that value plus some other kind of value you can add into it. And that's where you sort of draw the line for open core. There's other definitions of open core that are, I think, functionally useless. So just go with mine. But like,
I like yours. Yours is good.
But that model of like, how do we do it? That was HashiCorp's model. It was MongoDB's. It was Confluence. It was on and on and on, right? Chef, like, and what's wrong with that model is the part from a business point of view, forget about the open source part of you for a second, is that the most valuable thing you do, you set the price at zero. So there's something that the product does that's amazing. Terraform, so cool, does something awesome. And you've said it's worth nothing, right? And then not only is it worth nothing, you gave away the source code to it too. And the entire product process, the entire pipeline that brings that product into the world, you gave that away for free too. And it's the exact same thing that you will receive if you just hang out in open source land. Ubuntu is the perfect example of this. Ubuntu had a strategy. Simon Wardley very famously talks about how he guided this strategy for Ubuntu to take over adoption in the cloud. Ubuntu, far and away the most used operating system in cloud providers by a huge margin. Ubuntu struggling very hard to come anywhere close to the level of monetization that SUSE has in operating systems, right? So number 1 with a bullet, total utilization. Number 4 probably in monetization with a bullet, right? And struggling. And that's because Ubuntu took the core of their product and they gave it away for free. And over the years, they've been tinkering around the edges, trying to figure out what else they can convince you to pay for. And the answer is nothing. You want nothing from them, right? There's nothing of value really that you want from them.
Au contraire, my friend. I would like Juju.
You do not want Juju. No one wants Juju, right? And
what is Juju?
Sorry. It's another configuration management thing. It was the first time I went to Barcelona, actually. It was to try to convince them to use Chef and not build Juju, and it did not work. Anyway.
You want to build you don't want to rephrase Chef in terms of Juju charms?
I didn't. I tried. It didn't work. Anyway, so when I say that model is broken, what I mean is that from a business point of view, you create this incredibly difficult problem, which is you're hanging all of your monetization on this very inefficient monetization vector. What it's good for is that you open sourced it and it causes this humongous lift. So when you open source it and you get other people to use it and they go create value. So they do use Ubuntu and it like gets into their whole environment, and Ubuntu is great. People talk about it and they share it with each other. And all of a sudden there's way more people using Ubuntu than you ever could have convinced to use Ubuntu if it wasn't available to them for free. But then you have to convince those people to pay you, and you can't. And if you become a public company like HashiCorp, or like MongoDB, then you inevitably look at that sales pipeline and you look at the number of people who are using your software to get benefit. You look at what you receive from people who contribute back, which is almost nothing. And you go, wait a second. If we could convert, let's say we lost 80% of the Terraform market. It just evaporated. If that 80% was the open source part, the part where people used it for $0, but they got 20% of that large Terraform market to start paying them for Terraform Enterprise or Terraform Cloud, that is a fucking good quarter. Yeah?
Right. And that might even be the calculus. In as much as there is a calculus inside of HashiCorp, that might even be the calculus.
Oh, not mine. It is the calculus.
Absolutely. But Adam, to pick at this example, do you think, let's say, do you think Terraform is successful as a non-open source product? Like, do you think that if they can take that route without being open source from the jump?
At the size that they are now, I believe that they can be successful at doing that because people already recognize what Terraform is. HashiCorp can set the price at whatever they want to, and some large number of it'll be $0, right? They'll have slower growth perhaps than they had before. It opens the door for more Pulumi growth or whatever. But it'll work. From the jump though, I'm not sure they could have, right? I think the size of that open source community, the work that like Kelsey Hightower did, that lift that happens from being open source is so powerful. And I don't know how to replicate it in a way that is proprietary. I know how to replicate the business model of selling enterprise software. That's what Red Hat does. So what Red Hat does is they open source all the software, but under no circumstances can you get their product for free. Yeah. So you can take the software and do what you want with it, but you can't get it from Red Hat. If you want it from them, you must pay them something. Even if they set that number at low, Ansible is $0, for example, but it's like only Red Hat gets to make Ansible, right? And I think
and so Adam, is that your answer for like, okay, like open core is a disaster. So what do I do instead? What I do instead is if software is the vector, I am charging for the product. The product is open source, but it's the
software is open source. The product is absolutely proprietary. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
And that's what I think we should start shifting people to. And I think the evidence that tells you that that's a more efficient monetization vector is pretty clear in a bunch of different scenarios. You look at like Kubernetes monetization. Red Hat's got $1 billion in ARR. If in case you don't know, it's really hard to get $1 billion in recurring revenue. Like, it is really rare. HashiCorp, public company, nowhere close, right? Somewhere, they're hovering in the 420s, I think, in ARR.
Something like that, yeah. And then a lot of that is services and support.
Across a bunch of different product lines, right? Meanwhile, Red Hat, OpenShift, $1 billion in ARR and growing rapidly, right? On software they didn't create, that a foundation runs, right? That what they do is curate an enterprise product that they can produce and support and test and integrate and like do all of the Red Hat-y things. You can go get that exact product for free from somebody who's not Red Hat, but you won't because you can't run that product in Morgan Stanley, right? Morgan Stanley doesn't want a product that comes from like Bob in France, right?
But isn't that another way of what you're paying? So what you're paying for is brand, but you're also paying for services. You're paying for support. You're paying for that someone's going to stand by this thing. Isn't that what you're ultimately? I feel like
supply chain security. You're
paying.
You're paying for development time, engineers, expertise. You're paying for the product to be vended to you in the same way that you're the iPhone. I don't just get the software, right? If they just gave me all the software that runs the iPhone, it doesn't mean shit to me, right? What I want to do is go to a store, buy an iPhone, make a phone call, right?
But that's not a really fair analogy, is it, Adam? Because there you're talking about something physical that I couldn't replicate at home. Whereas,
this is the argument of every software engineer that I've ever had to explain this to instantaneously. They're like, well, but Adam, if I have the software, I can do whatever I can do it. And the answer is, sure you can, kind of. Except you also do actually want to know, like, who produced that software you're running? Where did it come from? How are they going to patch it? Do you know that they're going to do that? What's the agreement you have with them if there's a problem and you need to repair it and there's a priority one issue? Is it just like, and like on and on and on. So like software engineers tend to overvalue the shape of the software and the total arc of the product. But there's a ton of evidence that tells you that actual consumers, people who buy software, even in the large enterprise, don't particularly care for the software. They don't want the software. They want a product they can run. They want a problem they can solve. And if you charge them money for that problem, they will buy it. And if So
on the Terraform example, we roll back the clock.
Yeah.
Mitchell, doesn't put it up on GitHub, does put it on GitHub, but regardless, the way it's brought to market is not with us freeloaders, but rather as a packaged product that, oh, by the way, it happens to be open source, but you, Morgan Stanley, of course, like, you want to buy the product.
Yeah, if it was me, what I would have done, what I know to have done, I wouldn't have done it then because I didn't know this then. But like, I think the answer there is HashiCorp builds Terraform. Terraform's a product that they use their trademark and their distribution terms to set up a proprietary distribution of, much in the way that like VS Code is a proprietary distribution. The software itself is open source, but if you wanted to take that source code, Terraform, and not pay for the privilege of using the Terraform product that's built by HashiCorp, what you have to do is take that thing and fork it. You got to call it, AHL. And you got to like have AHL become your version of Terraform. And you could decide that that's a license in, license out version and all of those things. And you can collaborate with them in the upstream. But what you can never get is Terraform for free. And if they'd done that, they'd have been monetizing all along at a significantly better rate.
All right, so my counter to that would be that not everything can be monetized to the same degree. Not everything. So in particular, like if you cannot take Bash and turn that into,
but that's
like,
because Bash is not particularly valuable at this point.
Right, and I think
somebody
I would argue that
in
Terraform
the panel
is much
about like a hash table. They were like, "How can I monetize my hash table?" I'm like, "You can't. No one gives a fuck about your hash table." But that's not an open source business model problem. That's this software has no value as a product problem, right? Like, we're just not willing to pay money for that problem, right?
So Ashley, it's something actually. Now we're going to get really spicy because you worked for another company that was attempting to monetize a space that really wasn't clearly monetizable in terms of NPM.
Well, this is very funny because I wasn't sure if you were about to ask me what my plans are to monetize the tools that I'm currently building that are kind of similar.
I view that to be very gauche. That would be very gauche, frankly. As I might say.
It's fine. It's certainly something that I'm paying attention to, and I think is important. I guess the thing I'll start with is I don't think the package management space is unmonetizable. I just think that the way NPM went about doing it was terrible.
So I will take the other side of that.
I mean, these are not our favorite products, but like Artifactory exists, Sonatype exists. Like there are people who are taking your packages and are putting them places and then delivering them to you, and they are making a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
But NPM didn't do that.
Yeah, so I guess that's kind of my question is like, because Artifactory is it's a smaller business than I think NPM had eyes on being. Certainly than NPM's investors thought they were going to become.
NPM's investors would have done backflips if they could have been Artifactory.
Yeah, I know way so much. I feel like I've been competing with Artifactory my whole life. It's so weird.
Are we in like a rom-com with Artifactory somehow, or this is like?
I guess. I don't know, but I mean, Artifactory has surprisingly large contracts, is what I will tell you. I think that you'd be surprised. Like, literally, Apple uses Artifactory, and Apple doesn't like using third-party things very much. So,
yeah, JFrog's 2022 fiscal revenue was $280 million, 35% year-over-year increase. That's primarily Artifactory.
And that would, you're right. NPM would have killed for that kind of revenue. So
absolutely.
So actually, you say this space is monetizable, and indeed that
it's only becoming more so now that Adam already mentioned like the supply chain of your supply chain I mean, I love recursion, right? Anyways, it's becoming very, very profitable, I think. Like where the software comes from, where you're storing it, how you're delivering it, like is very important. I think there were a couple of problems with NPM's approach, and I was the little baby communist that I spoke of in the panel when I joined NPM, and so I met a lot of like harsh realities very quickly working there.
Is that going to be is that
But
going to be like a dramatized series on Hulu at some point? I just really want to go watch that. I just have this image of you. This is, who plays you, by the way, in the dramatization? Have you already kind of
hey,
figured that
I'm
out?
not sure, but I'll take suggestions. That would be very interesting. But I think that this kind of dovetails back to what Adam was saying, and I do think was a problem. And I don't think I signed an NDA at NPM. Anyways, it's all water under the bridge now. So old. But like one of the biggest problems, I think, if your company has like an open source tool somewhere in it, I don't know, maybe it's at the core, maybe it's more to the side. I think the key thing is that you can't be building two things. Like you can't be building like your product that you're trying to sell people and then like also the open source. I think there needs to be like a story about how those are the same, because if you end up building out two things, and that's what NPM was doing, like NPM Enterprise was like a complete fork of the entire thing. Like you're
Okay, that's a
undercutting
really
yourself.
interesting point.
Yeah.
You have like a
Yeah, 'cause
conflict of interest with yourself. Like we were competing internally. Like
Yeah.
it was
How
very
we did that, it
strange.
was
And
awful.
yeah, and I think a lot of companies do this. I don't think this is just NPM. Like I don't want to throw shade just on them. I think I've seen it in a lot of places. But that's
I mean,
definitely
Hashi
the messiest
famously did this with Atlas, right? I mean, Atlas is still not open source, I don't think, right? Was Atlas ever opened?
You're talking about MongoDB Atlas?
HashiCorp
Like,
Atlas,
what's
right?
Atlas?
Everyone's got an Atlas, it's great. So actually elaborate on this. Well, I determined if HashiCorp Atlas is actually a thing or some fever dream that I had.
A lot of products, and I cannot keep track of them. But like, I don't know. So this is like potentially really embarrassing, and I can only hope that some VCs that I like had this anguished conversation with like hear this and like I somehow become redeemed. But like for a long time trying to figure out what I was going to do at Axo, the thing that I was really stressed about was I was like, damn it, you can't sell software. The only thing you can sell is infrastructure. Like, so I'm just going to have to like take the software and then I'm gonna have to like figure out infrastructure that's really hard for people to build and then like sell them that and then we'll run our code on it. But
so actually repeat that. You can't sell people software, you can only sell them infrastructure. Did I play that back correctly?
The other thing that I will that is what I said, maybe that's not right. And like the thing I was really, and I can't say company names about this, but I had worked for companies that were doing this same kind of plan, ostensibly very high valuation companies. And just like depending on who your infrastructure provider is, like the margins here aren't the margins that people anticipate in software companies, right? Because everybody's developer experience product is an abstraction layer on top of somebody else's abstraction layer. And so we're all just like eking out like pennies on the dollar on top of somebody else's slightly harder to use thing. And I feel like there's like a tragedy there in that, like, can't we be building something greater, maybe?
There's
And
fully a
anyways,
tragedy there.
I spent a while like I was like, I'm gonna take some calls with VCs and like you're not supposed to take calls with VCs that like aren't invested in you and like try and have a brainstorm session. I'm just like a dumb little baby. But I was like, I don't want to sell infrastructure. Is there like any other option? And it's like, no, not really. And it's hard. And like the trick is that VCs are always attracted, I feel like, to software companies because of these like amazing margins that you can get. But now that we're on this like developer experience layer on infrastructure on top of layer of infrastructure, like move, like how that turns into a super high margin business. I don't know. There's certainly some creative work to do there. Probably along the lines of what Adam's talking about with like the productization, and that stuff does absolutely definitely matter.
Yeah. I mean, we literally haven't really talked about like as a community in venture, like the amount of time I spend just educating people on choices. Just like, okay, here's a situation, the situation is that your software is in the Apache Foundation and you want to build a proprietary thing. What do you do? And how do you think about that? Or what's the move? And like, why? Like, what are the comps? You know, what other companies can you see? Like, those conversations don't happen that much, right? And mostly you just follow the herd, which is totally what you're saying. It's like, well, right, the herd would launch on top of a cloud provider. You know, even you see people like I don't know where Railway is running right now, but I bet they're running a lot of that stuff in AWS, right? And when you imagine a business like that running on AWS, you're like, that cannot last, right? There's no way that they can pay margin on top of
There's
margin.
no way that's going to work with that. I mean, the rental model of compute, you have to own your own compute. That's going to work, Adam.
At some
If only
point,
there were another way.
if only there was
only there were
another
another
way.
way.
Like,
This is the thing I always said about Cloudflare. Like the reason Cloudflare I think works so well is everyone's like, Cloudflare's like, we're not a DNS company. I'm like, nope, they're not. They're a hardware company. Like the reason Cloudflare can make a shit ton of money is because they own metal all over the world.
yeah.
Like the more people who use it, the more money they make. Whereas for everybody else, the more you use it, the more your bills are.
But this is the same.
Which is
This is the same
complicated.
thing with open source monetization, right? It's the exact same problem. Today, like I said the other day on Twitter, what I thought was a very unspicy take, which is like DHH, who's not like a great person or whatever, but he like posted how much money he's saving with his Elasticsearch cluster. And I'm like, he's absolutely saving that much money. And the number of people who replied to me like, no, he's not. You don't know how to calculate total cost of ownership. And like
really?
just going around and around and around with me about how like you couldn't possibly run a search cluster as good as Amazon runs a bad search cluster for you. I'm like, that you're insane. It's insane. We've got amnesia. And
well, and I mean, also, like, can we all please tip the hat to capitalism's apex predator, Jeff Bezos, for
100%. Like
given people this kind of learned helplessness.
Oh, what a move!
Oh, what a move, man!
Just a glorious thing.
Okay.
But like, it's what's happening in open source too. When we talk about open source monetization, the same thing's happening. What do you do to monetize an open source company? Poor Ashley, she's going talking to venture capitalists. They ought to know better. They're like, what other moves do I have? They're like, I don't know. Those are the only moves we know, the only moves we see. So, you know,
that's what they told me. They basically were like, and we were saying no. And I was like, I wasn't even asking you for money.
Oh,
yeah.
I do. Oh, isn't it great? I love it when people pass on you and you don't even ask them.
I like getting denied when I didn't even ask.
Yeah, didn't ask.
Yeah,
but
it's just.
So here's the thing, and you asked me to channel baby communist Ashley here. So, like, I want there to be a world, and maybe this is because I'm just like I learned how to write software, and I think it's really cool to write software, and I'd love to like be able to pay for like my cost of living with it, like. Do we all just have to start buying up computers all over the world? Or like what's our answer here? Like software, like, and is software like not monetizable because open source? Like, did we just price fix it to zero? Like, is this something that it's not just like something that happened, or is it something that we made happen?
No,
and now we have to like figure out what to do?
We did
it to ourselves.
We absolutely did, but it was going to happen. I mean, it was inevitable. So
I don't think it was inevitable. We can fucking undo it tomorrow.
Did anybody at the beginning of open source? Did anyone when open source was like starting to happen, like go like, hey, like you're about to screw yourself? Was there any like there during that time?
No. So what you had is this era of proprietary software companies. And their disposition towards open source varied. And you had people like Microsoft at kind of one extreme that spent a lot of time and spilled a lot of ink talking about how open source is going to be the end of days. But the folks that were actively disrupting those folks rightfully said, like, no, actually, you're delivering an inferior product to people at a price that's too high. And open source actually allows people to get out from underneath the natural monopolies you have on your customer. So it was the kind of demand side where people that rightfully kind of generated all that energy. It is ironic to me that you have these then people that are very much born in that open source era that now then realize, like, wait a minute, like, what about me? How do I become a proprietary software company?
And the problem, we didn't like when back in that era, we didn't talk about the fact that like the monetization vector for our software like was like we all got high on the principles. And so there was like a group of people who were the lift of open source, and the lift of what it could do for other people is so powerful that it makes up for a bunch of inefficient bad models. And that that lift is very unmeasurable. You can't put it in a spreadsheet. And so like, I think when we say that open source sort of broke it, I think what happened is it did break it. And what broke it was we now know that this open source lift is real. When you build something valuable and you let other people also create value in their lives with that thing in whatever way they need to make their lives better, they do it. And it becomes better than it was before. It becomes stronger. It goes wider in the world. All those things happen. But as soon as we decided that what we were doing was disrupting incumbent players, we cut the price in half, right? Like Chef and Puppet did this. We were such dummies. Like Blade Logic was selling at 10 times the price that Chef and Puppet were, right? And because we were open core companies, we set the price for our products so low because the alternative was ourselves at $0. And like, it was dumb. It was bad business, but it was also bad open source strategy because none of those things are now sort of, I would argue that probably most people aren't happy with how those open source communities are being managed at this point because they were bought and sold and sent to other people. And right, like no shade on any of the acquirers. Anyway, it's just.
So I think so. To answer your question about like, how do we do it? What does it mean? So I do think, and I made this point in my deck, and my co-founder Steve Dock, who's here, a point that we try to make to venture capitalists, but they don't like to listen, is that you are fixated on gross margin when you should be thinking about net margin. And VCs don't want to focus. No one wants to talk about net margin. Like the people who want to talk about net margin are people that
That's what my conversation with those investors was about net margin, and I got like totally
they glaze over. And the reason they're going to glaze over is like, look, VCs are building to flip. This is the challenge with this model is that you are ultimately building to flip. You are building the company to sell it, and you are either going to sell it to the public if things go really well, or you're going to sell it to a private company if things go well, or you're going to sell it to the creditors if things don't go so well. So you are not actually, and these VCs, all the VCs that have, the Apple placard up on the wall or the Google placard up on the wall, they actually sold Apple when it was at 1/1000th of 1% of its current value. And they had to, because they had to actually, they've got a fund with a limited lifetime. And so what they are looking at, so they will, and I think this is where, and Adam, you and I strongly agree that it is the entrepreneurs ultimately to blame. All the entrepreneurs have to bear responsibility, not the VCs. But you need to be aware of what the model is around a venture funded business. And a high growth, high margin, high gross margin business is catnip to the next person you need to sell it to. It is not sustainable. So VCs will have you build HashiCorp and they will have you IPO it. And you will be now a $5 billion. Well, I guess Adam,
sub four now, but yeah,
four exactly. It's like the scene in Airplane. It's like now arriving, like
going
gate
down
13, gate 12. Yeah. So they are at a valuation that cannot hold in terms of what they're actually, in terms of the actual business. If they had focused on net margin earlier, they would have built a smaller business that is sustainable. And I think that we do not focus. You let VCs pump a ton of money, and then when they pump a ton of money into you, they want to see growth.
I
and
mean,
there are new VC firms out there like that are focusing on this, but I also think, and I do want to step back because I don't want us to be bashing on VCs too much, or even entrepreneurs, because I think this ambition is part of open source and everyone who participates in it, whether or not they have a company or not. And I don't think the ambition is terribly different.
No, and I think I'm pro ambition regardless.
Okay, so I'm going to say, all right, I will take the other side of that. I think when you got ambition, but without the kind of the massive investment, then you're like Lua or Curl, and great, good for you. I mean, it's like you just end up being ubiquitous in the substrate as opposed to.
Question, Brian. I actually don't know this about you. Brian, have you ever had an open source project and like it was very, very popular and no one would give you money to work on it?
No.
Because
no, I don't think. I don't know. Do I?
It's
like a
something
trap.
else. It's not a trap. It's just like I feel like there should be an empathy for that position somewhere in this conversation. And it feels a lot like the ambition of, say, like an open source company that doesn't build like a slow, thoughtful business strategy, ends up wildly successful with a massive customer base and absolutely no way to fund it. And that's a story that happens in open source all the time.
All the time. Yeah.
Like just
Okay,
for individuals.
so-
It happened to me multiple times. And here's the thing. They will bash you as the maintainer the same way we're bashing the VCs right now. And in a certain way, they're right, because your sin was ambition. And I've gotten my ass kicked by this so many times.
Yeah, and I think look, we should have I have empathy for everyone involved. Like what Brian was just saying about net margin, like it's true in that like ultimately you need to become a profitable company. The actual marker of your profit is net profit. But like when you're playing the venture capital growth game, often if you're running net profit but the growth numbers aren't as high as they could be, that's a bad way to spend their money. And because you could be growing quicker. And like if you want to see what happens when VCs start to care about net profit, get to a place where the growth starts to slow and your ARR number is creeping up toward $100 million. And next thing you know, every board meeting you're having is about net profit margin. So like, you know,
for sure, but only because they want to flip. Again, like they're trying to flip ultimately, which is fine.
Well,
I mean, I'm not faulting them for it, but it's like they've got a limited budget. They need to flip it.
But also, like as an entrepreneur, you'll want to too, because there's all these people who have stock, and you're going to try to get them as much money as you can, right? Because they've put their lives behind this thing you're trying to build. So, like, I just like I very much wind up on the entrepreneur end of that argument. I think venture capitalists are what they are, and we sort of you know what they are, and you know what their business model is, and if you don't, you can find out. And there's certainly bad actors who will not tell you the truth about what they're looking for, but most of them will, especially if you say like, I know what you are. And I think to Ashley's point about like, you know, if you have a big popular open source project and that success runs away with you, like it's difficult to figure out after the fact what the right thing to do is to sort of get yours. And you know what I mean? like if you're like, hey, I've built this massively popular open source project, everybody's using it, they hate me because I'm not like building it fast enough or whatever, I'm having trouble like making ends meet. It's pretty difficult at that moment to decide like, oh crap, like now what do I do? Like how do I get mine? Like how do I support these people? And like when we don't, we wind up in this like interesting burnout cycle. And when we talk about sort of the complexity of open source and we talk about open source and capitalism, that angle I think is the one I have the most empathy for, because those people are putting in great work, incredible effort, often very load-bearing effort, and we just cannot figure out how to get them paid at all.
Okay,
and like,
but really, I mean, I think that we say getting mine. I don't know exactly what that means, but in terms of, I mean, if we are actually talking about like putting food on the table, and it'd be kind of interesting to know. It's like, so Postgres is an example where for many, many years, this isn't true. There was not a company that was built around Postgres.
Right.
Ultimately, like Citus was built on Postgres, but they had a bunch of stuff that was not part of Postgres, and then ultimately exited to Microsoft. But like, I mean, Tom Lane and Josh Burkus and all those folks. I mean, like, I don't know. Maybe they were like struggling to eat. I don't know. I mean, it feels like they.
I don't think they were buying houses in the Bay Area.
Sure, but I mean, I guess that's kind of
Brian,
the question.
do you know
is like, what is the
Substack
bar?
is?
Whose
I feel like-
Substack is? Yes, yeah, definitely, yeah, for sure. Yeah,
Okay.
I had to like, I had to like go through my 2011 time machine for sure.
Sorry,
Makes a
yeah,
lot
but
of sense.
Substack is the picture, the XKCD that somebody posted here. And like, I mean, I know a lot of folks that have created an immense amount of value and have not been able to recoup it. And I guess I kind of want to pop the stack a little bit, only because like we talked about open source businesses behavior, and like the goal of the LF and popularizing like open source was like to get companies to use it. I think a real question is just like, how do we get more open source companies to like exist? Or is the idea that like we don't want that to happen? Because like I do think we're seeing like a consolidation in open source that is like amplifying the problem that we are talking about.
Okay, hot take. I think it's fine if fewer of them exist. I think it's actually okay. I think it might even be good for Ball if fewer of them exist. And I think that if Mongo had never been turned into a company or Redis had never been turned into a company, it would have been fine. And I think that I kind of look at evidence of that. It's like there's not a company around Python. There's not a company around Perl. There's not a company around Apache.
So Brian, some of those may be different.
Around Python called Anaconda. Anyways.
Okay. It like everyone likes to use Red Hat as their example of successful open source companies, but I remember feeling in the early 2000s that Red Hat was almost conjured out of existence because it needed to exist. That is to say, there were all these financial services companies at the time who were deploying Linux who wanted someone to yell at when it broke. And if it hadn't been, okay, go for it.
I think that Red Hat needed Spark to exist. And x86.
Oh, it fully did, because that's why. Yes, of course it did.
I mean, like Red Hat, like the greatest lie the devil ever told is that this machine, this Linux machine, is outperforming the Solaris machine.
But our actual sin here with Red Hat, Adam, is that when we talk about Red Hat as an open source success, we always talk about anything but their business model. We talk about the market circumstances. We're always like, well, in these circumstances, they could pull it off. In these circumstances, it was okay. It was because they had IBM. It's because Solaris was overcharged. Sun was overcharging for Spark. It's because this. It's
Spark
because
that.
Because this. I mean,
if Spark and x86 flip roles, x86 was just like, it was cheaper and faster and better. I mean,
and all that's real. And also, they also happened to figure out, by accident, I think, but they did figure out the most efficient way to monetize the lift that you get from building massive open source communities. They've done it over and over and over again. And whenever anybody says, well, why don't we do that? The answer is always, well, you don't have the market circumstances to let you do it. Now you're just selling support. Now you're doing this. Now you're doing that. Part of why I don't talk about selling support is that, like, to Brian's point about VCs only loving net margin, like, they also hate it when you say you sell support.
Yeah, you can't.
Right?
Yeah, they don't like services.
They'll like that.
They don't like that. But if you say you're selling, ARR, if you're selling SaaS revenue, they love that.
I like that now. No, I like that. I like the cut of your jib.
I like that reoccurring SaaS revenue. And so when we talk about Red Hat or we talk about those things, I think you have to separate out the dynamics that meant that the software that they produced or the products that they built were competitive in their market, which absolutely is true and happened, from the business dynamics that allowed them to monetize it at a degree of efficiency. And Red Hat run away. It's not just Red Hat, like Red Hat, SUSE. SUSE's been public twice now, sold like 5 times or something over and over again. Like, those companies are really efficient in monetizing in a way that like nobody else is. And like Larry Wall, like there was no company around Perl, but also like, who thinks Larry Wall got enough money in relative terms to the impact he had on the industry? Because I think Larry Wall probably got I'm sure he's a happy person or whatever. I'm actually terrified to meet Larry Wall. So
Adam has got Larry. Now when we do our Larry Wall stories, Adam?
Maybe I need a beer in hand for my Larry Wall meeting story. Suffice to say, I had the wrong heroes when I was a high schooler.
I'm so scared of meeting Larry Wall. I can't do it.
Justifiably. Let me just be really clear.
Adam says, honor your fears.
Yeah,
but I don't think Larry Wall. Sure. But I don't think Larry Wall probably got enough
That's such an interesting concept of like getting yours or getting enough. Yeah. Like, just because you've created value for other people, like, what entitlement do we have to the value that we've created without capturing?
And now we're talking about greediness.
Like you talk about Larry Wall. It's like he's done great things, and certainly high school Adam Leventhal believed that he did great things. But I'm not sure that he like that. I don't know that we owe him anything in particular. And I think that the typical path to monetization for folks like that, or the traditional one, is to be hired by Google. And I don't know then what you have to do there, but maybe that's dried up.
I mean, I think about like Mark Burgess. Mark Burgess in configuration management, infrastructure as code, automation in general. No one's done more to move that art forward than Mark. And like, and I'm not saying that he deserves something, because he doesn't. He made his choices. He knew what he was doing. I'm an American or whatever, you know. But like, but at the same time, like, I don't think we've figured out how to help folks who have put incredible value into the world. They have made it possible for lots of people, lots of companies to be successful and to thrive, and how to make sure that those people are taken care of for their work. And it's not because we owe it to them to be taken care of, but like, my career wouldn't exist at all without Larry Wall, right? It just wouldn't. Like, if Larry Wall hadn't written Perl, I don't think I'd have a career. And same with Mark Burgess. If he hadn't written that configuration, those early computer immunology papers, like, I don't know what my career would have been. It would have been very different at the very least. And like, I think there's something inside the conversation around open source and capitalism that like, where because what we're doing is creating software that is limitless as long as you have the compute to run it. They can go into the world. Anyone can take it. You can do what you want with it. You can read it and understand it. It's such a powerful force. And yet, if you build something that's truly fantastic and you're not very careful about how you want to monetize that, or if you want to, then it can easily run away with you. And suddenly lots of other people have changed their lives materially, and your life is roughly where it was. And that, you know, whether it's right or wrong, it doesn't always feel particularly fair.
Yeah. So one of the ways I like to talk about this, especially when I find myself in what I would call mixed company, because again, baby communist actually got very sad about open source, but remained mostly communist. Is like, you have to think about an economy like as a technology. And if we were like, think about the free market, the way the people who love the free market think about the free market, they believe that the free market economy is a very efficient technology at distributing resources to the people who can create the most impact with them. And so if that's true, then we have a big problem on our hands with this. Like, this entire conversation would kind of suggest that the economy is broken if that is what it is supposed to be doing. And so I loved that we're talking about greediness, and then even this kind of like offhanded like language of like, get yours, get mine. But like, I do think it is valuable to try and think about like, what is this work worth? And certainly there seems to be some amount of worth to it, because people will spend an immense amount of time on it. Yeah. Like, there's a value here, and there's a value that is incredibly difficult to capture, which I think is complicated. Yes. And probably like, if I was smart enough or like had enough capital, like that's the problem that I think I'd like to see solved. I wish, I don't know, I could go back to school and do like a PhD in economics on this like exact
I wish you
problem.
could.
I really want to do it really badly. This is a call to anybody who would like to fund my PhD.
I mean, I think open source, as it was as invented, and then as it has played out since it was invented, is essentially utilitarian at its core. And I think it has all of the utilitarian failings that happen there. Like, what is the conception of the good, right? Like, what exactly is it that we mean? What is it we're maximizing when we talk about the utility of something? And why? And then like, what happens when, you know, the utility monster comes and it just like, it gets more good from the same unit of utility than everybody else does, and therefore it deserves all of the yummies, you know? And like we see all of those same philosophical problems inside open source communities and inside open source businesses. And I do believe that there's something there in the responses in like political philosophy to utilitarianism that perhaps points a finger at how we can think about changing the way open source functions. But you have to start talking again about the conception of the good. Like, I say get mine a lot in this conversation, and that I was doing it to be pointed, right? Like, it wasn't an accident. I was saying it that way because I was I was poking at it because
Yeah,
like
I did not mean to say it was an accident, by the way. So sorry if it came off that way.
yeah, it's okay.
Not
I just
at all
wanted to
what
make sure people knew I was doing it on purpose. Like
That is an ironic get
Yeah.
mine, please.
Yeah.
I'm talking about an ironic, metaphorical get mine.
but the reason is that like when you think about like when we think about open source and the utility of it, like I think we do actually need to have a conversation that says what are the goods that come out, the not goods like stuff, goods like in your heart, things that are valuable to you, us as people, that we receive through participation in open source communities. It's wider than money. One of them happens to be money. Like a reason people participate or that we build these things is for money. But we don't spend a lot of time talking about what those goods are or what the social contract is between us. And even Brian in his talk talked about how the social contract is sort of embedded in open source, but that social contract is a very utilitarian social contract, and it's problematic. And it leads, I think, to a lot of the underlying problems that we've been talking about for the last hour. Like there's just a lot of how humans interact with each other and how we behave and what is it we agree on and don't, that we're playing out, that we kind of already know leads to shitty outcomes.
Well, and I think there's a certain degree, this is where you get to kind of like the increasing divisiveness, societal divisiveness. And I think that and maybe this is just, maybe I'm actually like full adult communist Brian. But I think that if you are seeking to capture all of the value you create, you're going to live a life of resentment. And
Totally.
and especially in open source, you are going to create more value than you capture. And so you need to figure out a way, and I think that you can't get bent out of shape about that. And I think that you're just going to make yourself miserable if you get. I mean, you know, Adam Leventhal. I feel like
I'm going to poke at this. I'm going to poke at this because I think you have to get bent out of shape of it, and this is why. And this is coming from my history of assuming that open source was like creating software that literally anyone should be able to contribute to. So when I showed up, very classically, it was like, why is everyone here white and a dude? And what I didn't know at the time, but is probably just very functionally true, also like kind of rich, like in the scheme of things, like globally. Like if we want open source to look more diverse, then we need to be able to guarantee that the value capture is like at least some. And like we can't do that.
For sure.
And like I think like it is okay and actually kind of good to get bent out of shape about it, because most people can't afford to just like give away a bunch of shit for free.
Yes. And when we talk about the distribution of the goods, we talk about like whatever it is that people get out of open source that's valuable to them. We don't set up social contracts that actually talk about the fact that we are not all equal in our position relative to that distribution. And and because of that, there are circumstances we don't want to find ourselves in. For example, Kelsey Hightower does not want to find himself rug pulled after having spent 10 years being an incredible vocal advocate for HashiCorp, right? He wouldn't have done that for Microsoft for free, right? But he did it for HashiCorp for free because it was open source and he thought he was doing the right thing. And suddenly he was on the wrong side of the line. And like, I think that conversation and that idea that there's a social contract embedded in what we do, like we have to talk more about it if we want to solve the more fundamental problem. We can talk about how to solve it in business. It's kind of more clear because the puts and takes are more obvious, but ultimately it is about saying like, who gets to participate? What are we willing to accept if we don't know like what our position is going to be in relative terms, and what aren't we? And I think that conversation is one that I don't really see happening in open source.
Yeah,
right?
I totally agree with you, Adam. And I think that because on the flip side of it, when you've got this kind of this avarice in companies, and not because I think to clarify what I'd said earlier about, I think it's when you get hung up on capturing all of the value that you create that is problematic.
Sure. I agree with that.
And because then I mean, rightfully, someone in the chat is like, all right, so when do I get my free Oxide rack, Mr. And it's like, no, you're not gonna do that. The beauty of open source the beauty of software is that the cost of goods sold are zero. The cost of goods sold of our rack is not zero. The cost of goods sold, that because it's a physical thing, it has to live in the real world. Software lives in this unbelievable world that is a confluence of information and machine. It is truly unique, and it gives us this extraordinary capability to create this massive amount of value with effectively no cost of goods sold. And as a result, you are not going to capture all of it. And so the question, but then I think the flip side is when you have this kind of, when people view that as like, oh, great. So these morons are going to create value, and I am therefore going to come in and capture all of it. And I am now going to, Adam, to your point, I am now going to rip up the other end of the social contract. And I will actually, the Dave McJanet, I will capture their value.
Or the
CNCF.
Wrong. I had this conversation with look at the service mesh space. Like Linkerd, it's a crime that Linkerd is not a huge company. That was such a great piece. It's such a great piece of software. It's so good. And it's in the CNCF and everything. And you know who the winner is? Istio.
Right.
And not because it's better, right? I've got some, I mean, okay, I've lived that life. I mean, I get it.
And ask me about eBPF.
Exactly. And so what's happening in those spaces, when we're talking about it, it's not that there'd be some better way to pick a winner or whatever, but it's just, I don't know that when the folks at Linkerd were deciding what to do and how to orient their business, I'm not sure that they made the right decision by putting that software into that foundation that way, right? I'm not sure that meant that the work that they put in to build that piece of software to make sure other people could run it for $0 to move forward the service mesh space. I'm not sure that the rules of the game that they set up were the right rules for them, right? Maybe they think they are, but I bet they have regrets. I don't know that they have regrets, but I'd have regrets if I were them. And yeah,
I have regrets that you don't have regrets. I think you should have regrets.
So I've got so many regrets.
What if they didn't? What if they're like, you know what? Well, it'd be interesting. I mean, it's like, oh yeah, no, we created this thing, and actually a bunch of people use it. There's a false dichotomy between kind of winners and losers in software, because when you create these things, they do survive effectively in perpetuity. Folks are asking me in the chat, wait a minute, the cost of goods sold is not zero. It costs a whole bunch of energy to create it. It's yes, the cost of goods sold is actually zero. So it doesn't cost the actual, once you have written it, the cost is zero. And this is very unlike anything else it's more like a movie or a song. It has this, recorded things have this kind of the same attribute. So Adam, what advice would you, let's get to some of the advice that you would dispense if you've got, either go back in time to whether it's Linkerd. What advice would you give Linkerd? Not to go to a foundation, perhaps. What should?
I'll give it to Chef because it's easier, because I lived it, and I can see icons in the chat that I know. So I have regrets about the way we ran. I wish I'd known the things I know now when I was running that business then. The regrets I have around it are primarily around the return. I think we did a good job of maximizing as much of that return as I could to the people who had put their lives and energy into building it, and trying to find a good space for that software so that the community that had been built around it could have a shot at sort of continuing to thrive. I don't know that all those things worked out for the best in the end, but I think the number one thing is that if you want to ensure that your open source community can reach as many people as possible and have the biggest impact possible on their lives, the best way to do that is to be as successful a business as you can possibly be. Because what makes it possible for you to do all of those things that enable those good things for people is because you're continuing to generate value and continuing to be able to fund that value sort of across the horn. If you built a great open source community that was funded on venture capital dollars that eventually falls apart because, to your point about net margin, it can't sustain itself, I don't know that was, it's great that the software exists, but it will be fundamentally different. Rethink DB is not what it was, And I think, and And I think so that's one thing. The other is that you have to think about your business model as a business model separate from the open source dynamics. So there are dynamics that happen in open source that are a combination of the license, there are copyright holders, there's patents, there's trademark law. The overlap of all of those things are what create your ability to use open source to impact your business. I think and so the situation is different, right? The folks who who built Temporal, like, had to fork it from Cadence. Cadence was a thing that they wrote while they were at Uber. They left. It was open source. They took it. They forked it. Made Cadence. Now the Cadence is or Temporal is what the company is, and Cadence is the software they forked it from. And they needed to do that because they needed to own the trademarks for the software that the company they were going to build, right? And then they had to figure out how to collaborate or not with, the original upstream or those pieces. So like each company has their own sort of complicated thing. To me, I really believed that the right thing to do was to try to mitigate the tension between the community's needs and what the open source community wanted and believed and what they saw as good both for themselves and for each other, and what the company needed, and that you were trying to straddle some kind of balance between them. And I think that's a fundamental mistake. Like, in truth, they have to be the same thing. Like, if those dynamics are not identical, if what's good for the community is not what's good for the driving monetary force behind the software or the product, then eventually that company is going to do something bad to that community, right? They're just gonna, because that there isn't a social contract that's been written down. There aren't really consequences in the way that you imagine there could be because you hurt someone's feelings who has less power than you do. And I think we have to be intentional about how we create those dynamics, especially if you're a person like me or like Ashley or like you, Brian, or Adam, who like is actually emotionally sensitive to wanting to actually have the good, valuable part of open source exist in the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
very much so.
And we just don't do it. Like, we don't talk about that when we talk to entrepreneurs about the open source stuff that they build. We don't say like, hey, how do you keep this in line? Like System Initiative is Apache licensed because I know that there's people who would consider building on top of System Initiative, but wouldn't if I used the GPL. And at the same time, I'm pretty sure it should be GPL'd because then I couldn't rug pull you if I wanted to.
Interesting.
And so, Adam, who is the model of a company in this regard? If someone's like, all right, I'm a startup, I want a company I can look up to. Who's doing it right? I mean,
you have Red Hat only. If you're talking about this not from a always as the best open source actor, but if you're looking at efficient monetization of open source software, it's Red Hat by an incredible margin, and everybody else is an also ran.
Okay, and then so I say, I think Red Hat was kind of lucky, and I think that they ended up with this kind of critical mass because of this kind of historical.
That's what everybody will always say. And then you'll go off and build an open core business, and when that business goes public, and we look at your books, you're going to be just a twinkle in God's eye of the efficiency of Red Hat, and you'll explain it away by situation and circumstances. But I don't think it is. I think it's really straightforward. I think there's a reason that they sell products at a higher price point and more of it than their competitors do. Because if the alternative was true, why doesn't Ubuntu win? Ubuntu's everywhere. Yeah.
So
yeah,
Red Hat was not that long ago. I guess I want to have optimism, but I think I tend to be a little bit more on Brian's team here. But instead of thinking like, oh, I'll make an open core business and just, it'll suck or whatever. Like, just is there a business model that includes open source in some capacity that works? Like, because there hasn't been another Red Hat yet.
There have been. SUSE, like I said earlier, follows Red Hat's model. Chef is now no longer a standalone company, but we followed that model, and when we did, our revenue went up relatively significantly. I think and it's kind of like asking, like Oxide builds computers. Why hasn't there been a great computer company in a long time, right? And like as evidence of why it is that there shouldn't be a great computer company. Kind of the same. Like the truth is, it's because open source is really complicated.
Yeah, that's fair.
The dynamics of how open source overlaps with how we build product is complicated. Most of the people we talk to don't understand the delta. Like it took me many, many years of study and time to understand the distinction between the software license and a distribution license, and that those two things don't have to be the same. I didn't know that took a long time to figure out. And and that's like one of dozens of things you need to know in order to think more clearly about how you stack up all the different tools in the tool belt to change the way the model works. So like, and at the same time, everybody's just telling you, well, look, just because it's inefficient doesn't mean I don't get to be HashiCorp or MongoDB, right? Like MongoDB, Elastic, these are public companies. They're all billionaires, right? You hear Mitchell Hashimoto giving a talk about how they built an incredible company and went public, and he's flying an airplane and writing a terminal emulator. And he's like, yeah, open core, bitches. And then, here we are, Oxide and friends. And I'm like, well, my little open source company only got to 80 million in ARR, and then I had to sell it to Progress, And you're like, don't listen to that guy. Fucking Mitchell Hashimoto's got a plane,
It's a really nice plane.
I bet it is. Have you been on his plane?
No, I've just seen the pictures he tweets out.
The pictures are
really
beautiful.
Nice. Pictures are beautiful.
I like Mitchell. Mitchell, I'm sure, is having a great life. But I mean, there's a lot of evidence that open source is so powerful that it makes up for this terrible inefficiency. And so, yeah, I'm actually quite optimistic that we're going to figure it out. It's just a question of how much longer are we going to stay in the dark.
Okay, so I would like to also point out that there's another route that I would call the coward's route, because it is my route, which is to actually sell a product, build a product that is not the software product, in which the software is very important, but it's also ancillary. And that's what we've done at Oxide.
Yeah,
right?
Sure. Which, look, I'm all in, right?
I would like to. There are other really important. There have been important open source contributions from. I mean, we talked about Uber earlier, right? From Uber, from Lyft, from LinkedIn, from Amazon, from Google, from Meta. These companies that have actually an unrelated business, and that business is it can support the development of open source software, and they contribute that back to the commons. So I think that that is a model, and it's. I know that it's not always what people want to hear, but we have been kind of implicitly or explicitly talking about really pure software companies. I'd also like to point out, not to be too morbid, but software companies just tend to consolidate no matter what. I mean, there was a huge. I mean, before the .com boom, totally. there was a tremendous boom in software companies in Silicon Valley in the 80s, more or less all of which consolidated into basically Oracle, Microsoft, IBM. And also, it's been kind of interesting that we've been talking about Red Hat as if it's an independent company, which is kind of interesting. I mean, I guess that they succeeded in tricking us. And I mean, when you've been saying Red Hat, you actually mean IBM.
Well, now I mean IBM, but I would argue that part of the danger of Red Hat being acquired by IBM is that even when you talk to people at Red Hat, and I've tried because I feel like I had this revelation about what their actual business model was and how it functioned. And then I went deeply in search of people who got it, right? I was like, oh my God, is that how this works? And then I was like, I couldn't shut up about it. And I used every trick I had to gain access to people to be like, will you talk to me about this? And I went and found open source lawyers, and I talked to there is a cadre of people who really understand that what I'm saying to you is really true. And they don't talk about it because for them, it was a competitive hedge. It was a competitive weapon they had that they knew how to do this and other people didn't. And they built a company around it that is successful. But also over time, of course, the knowledge of where that comes from erodes. So companies behave like their founders for a really long time, even when their founders are gone,
Yes.
Because their spirits just sort of infuse the place, I
mean, it's amazing that we are now way more than a decade past the life of Steve Jobs, and Apple it still has many trademarks of Jobs.
They'll have it for 100 years, right? If you go to Walmart headquarters, it's covered in Sam Walton, he'll be there forever. But Red Hat's the same, right? There's this storyline of who they are. So one of the big risks was that IBM doesn't actually understand what those dynamics were and are, right? and in fact, like probably has a counter view of what those dynamics were and how to monetize them best, and was and dramatically less efficient and bad at it, right? So like there's a real risk that Red Hat itself actually stops being great at what made Red Hat's business model so efficient.
You have none. So I want to just
Well, I was going to say, Brian, there's something that you said that I want to pull on, and I don't know if it'll end up making the conversation, because I'm sure we're kind of wrapping up, but like I don't want to make it end on a negative note necessarily. But you just kind of reiterated this about like software companies inevitably consolidate. I think, and maybe this is just totally off base, that one of the great things about open source is that it is kind of like a check on that consolidation, because there's always people spinning up all these weird little projects.
Yep.
One of the trends I see in open source more and more, especially if you're looking at like university folks and folks who like want to participate in open source, like they're not going the independent route. Like they're going the go get the like 200K junior developer salary at like Microsoft and like work on open source via these large organizations. And if you look at the people contributing to the popular open source projects these days, like the percentage of contributors coming from massive companies has never been higher. Like literally has never been higher. You had shared that you think maybe it's good if there's less open source companies. And I think I disagree. One, because it's self-serving, and that's obvious. But two, I don't think the consolidation's good.
Obviously. I mean,
well, you said it. You said you thought it would be good. And I was like, whoa, I think that has some really long-term system effects that I don't like.
I agree.
I think those are really bad system effects. And that's why I care so much about this open source company problem, because I want software not to consolidate, and I want there to be expanding opportunities for people who can't get those 200K Microsoft junior developer jobs. And if we want that future, then we like really need to solve the like, why is the open source business problem? Like we need to solve that and like tell everybody. Otherwise, like the future's bad.
Fuck yeah,
that's
Ashley.
what I care about.
Fuck yeah. I'm 100% on Team Ashley. Like, and because I think that's the crux of it. Like the actual thing about open source and capitalism here is that like the open source part, we keep talking, Brian's point that software is the unique is really, really real. And that unique nature of the software means that there's a unique societal thing that's happened through open source and free software that we've only begun to understand.
Yes.
And if we figure out what that uniqueness is, like what is it about that allows us to empower other people to change their lives? Like at Chef's peak, I had people coming up to me in the street, like thanking me for writing Chef and for the change that it had on their lives. Most of them weren't Chef customers. They were just people who used Chef, right? They like, you know, fed their family because they got a job as a, you know, they got paid more, like whatever it was. Like that, there were real people that like that because it was open source, it changed the arc of who they were. And that's certainly what's happened in my life. And like, I think we have to figure out how to align those things together into a theory of what it means to create open source in a way that at its core cherishes that unique aspect of it. And that if we don't do that, then we're just going to be stuck in this cycle of people like being, you know, Dave McJanets, right?
Yeah. Okay. So, and it's not clear if I'm allowed to be on Team Ashley, because I feel like Team Ashley was constructed too. Like, so I can't be picked on Team Ashley, but I would like to also join Team Ashley.
The thing you said that stuck with me, and I got worried about it.
Right. So just to be clear, I think that I think, Adam, what you said is really important. I think I would also add to that, it's important to find a way to do it to build truly sustainable businesses. And those businesses may be smaller, but they may be more enduring. And
I think it has anything to do with their size. Like,
I think it does. In terms of headcount, I think it definitely does.
I mean, Sure.
I mean, it's like Docker could not support the headcount that it had. It just couldn't.
I mean, we should talk about it.
I think
this is just a series now.
well, fortunately, actually, we've recorded. We've been shooting our mouths off for so long. We actually already have one where we've shot our mouths off about Docker.
On Docker, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that you need to. I do think you need to kind of figure out how to be sustainable. And which is not to say, I mean, I don't think, and Adam, you raised a very good point about it is a responsibility to find a way to be profitable, because otherwise we can't do all the other things we want to do in the world. And that actually, I don't know if you know this, but that is very much rhetoric from HP, from the kind of height of HP, the good HP. HP had the same idea. HP was at the time, a very good capital G company, but felt that like if our first responsibility has to be for the profitability of the business, because otherwise we perish. We can't do all these things. Narrator's voice, they perish anyway. But
Okay, but wait, I feel like this has come up a lot, and maybe again this is self-serving. I have no idea, but I think that there is a responsibility. Like, okay, yeah, everyone's going to talk about communism and get in the chat, but whatever. I think there's a responsibility as like leaders and stewards in open, like just saying like, well, if you want to have a business, you better figure out how to make it sustainable. Like, sure. I don't think that's interesting advice. I think there's a much more interesting like thing to do that could be like a much higher impact like area to work in, which is like as stewards and leaders of this community, like we all care about open source so much. And we already said part of the way in this conversation that like early decisions of people doing open source in general kind of led to some of these side effects. Like, I feel like this is something that OSI should be looking at. I don't know. Like, I feel like there's an opportunity for like larger groups. Like just saying like, oh, little business person, like you really want to make money with your open source. That's cute. Good luck. Like, I think this is a bigger thing.
I think you're right. And OSI will be particularly hard to do that because they're really.
I know.
But I think it should be. They need to expand. You mentioned Docker, so I just want to toss out Docker's current business model is like 95% aligned to Red Hat's.
For sure, after they've recapped the company.
But guess what? Once they decided to charge people money, everybody got real mad about it. Now they're like, anecdotally, we don't have any evidence, but let's just say between friends, the rumor mill says that company popped more than $100 million in ARR. And that's also very hard to do. And it happened because suddenly, if you want Docker brand Docker, you got to fork over your $5 a month. Yeah. And it turns out enough people did, and now they're making a bunch of money. So, I'm stoked for them. It's like one of the great open source business turnarounds of all time. And but we're not talking about it like that. Mostly we talk about it where we're like, there used to be a free Docker and now it's not, And I'm like, no,
because the company was recapped. I mean, a bunch of people lost a ton of money. A lot of investors lost a ton of money.
Yeah, but we don't care.
The only ones
Nobody should
making
care
money
about how investors did.
Sure.
Nobody should give a fuck about how venture capital did.
Sure, but there's a reason that people are going to be like, I mean, it's great that that Docker, and maybe you could argue that like the Docker now is the model that you're talking about, but they need, but with much less headcount, with a focus on that sustainability. I also like the analogy in the chat that it's like, this sounds like Theodore Roosevelt era conservation, and like we need like a national park system for.
We do.
And I actually really like the idea of like because I think as we look forward, I think foundations played an important role in the last 10 years. I think they're going to play an even more important role in the next 10.
I think it depends. I want foundations to like, I guess this is something I've been chasing for so long, but like I really want foundations to be these things that they just like aren't for a lot of reasons. And like the first one would be the idea of taking business advice from almost any of them, because they are not run terribly well. And I mean, there's a joke about nonprofits there, but the LF, on the other hand, seems to be a very interesting and very successful business. Their 990 is
money.
I would love their money. But I mean, maybe with this angle, we would see a new generation of foundations that have higher operational skills. I don't know. Is that too dark on foundations? Am I the only one who
I don't
thinks
think
that
it's
they're
too
like
dark.
not
I mean,
impressive generally?
I think we're liable to wind up with foundations as a dominant force, and that would be a shame if we don't figure out how to help people be able to build efficient businesses the way Brian describes, or in whatever other way they want to build them. If the only way to get spread and to get paid and all of those things is to go through a foundation, I don't think that's net good for open source in general, because there's a lot of potential goods there that sort of get left by the roadside. And I think, I don't know, maybe what's going to happen is that like Ashley and Brian and me and whoever else wants to join the like little cabal should just become the like open source business model cabal.
I told you I've taken the coward's way. I started a computer company so I could have this like unequivocal open source model that I don't have to worry about, changing licenses.
Look, man, I tried to take the coward's way and just build a proprietary SaaS company, and then I was like, this thing really should be open source.
You buckled. Unfortunately, it's like it's really hard to actually like give away hardware. So
I was overwhelmed by my principles.
Exactly. Well, this has been great. I think I will let the P99 folks know that actually you only needed to let us run for another hour and 37 minutes. So I'm not sure why you got the hook prematurely, and I feel like we could go like actually quite a bit longer.
Well, I mean, I think Adam is basically suggesting that we create some sort of informal, almost maybe even becomes formal group, and just like be the people that we want to exist to help with this problem.
I mean,
I have to be careful because I'm very susceptible to that type of call.
I mean, look, I can say this for sure. Like after we got off that call, I don't remember exactly what the order of operations was, but like Ashley pinged me on Discord and we were like, that was so fun, we should talk some more. And I think Brian was immediately like, that was so fun, we should talk some more. And then we went straight to like open source is utilitarian and that's where all the problems come from. And we were like, yes. And we got like very nerdy about we haven't
even talked about the Protestant ethic yet. Anyways,
we didn't talk about the Protestant work ethic. There's a lot of
we got to talk about Calvinism. So are certain open source projects preordained into heaven based on their GitHub stars? Is this the neo-Calvinism for open source?
Yeah.
All right. Obviously.
And like,
I think that is a hot take.
Yeah, but I think there really is a very legitimate kind of work that needs to get done, and I don't know how or where it happens, that is actually like an actual study of what these dynamics are, because it's all anecdotal. And if you want to avoid HashiCorps in the world, you have to turn that anecdotal thing into something that you can at least hang an intellectual hat on. And right now you really can't. Like, it's just vibes versus, spreadsheets.
It's just vibes. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
It's just vibes. Sounds like, well, this has been great. Thank you both. Thank you, all three of you, for I like the I feel Adam Leventhal with two Adams here. I'm kind of channeling my inner John McLaughlin. Did you watch the McLaughlin Group?
No.
Issue number 4, Open Source Foundations, Adam Leventhal. No, this is not.
Exactly.
I feel like this was like when Mike Myers did his Jean Chrétien impersonation on Saturday Night Live. It was just like deafening silence because no one had any idea who Jean Chrétien was. Anyway, whatever. Should not do the John McLaughlin impersonation.
In this episode, there's been a lot of voices. It's been very theatrical.
I loved your McLaughlin Group voice, and I knew exactly what you were doing. That was amazing.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Someone else was drifting through PBS at the wrong hours of the night in 1985. But this has been great, and it's been really. Thank you all for coming back and picking this up. Thank you for those of you in the chat. I know we had a lot of good stimulation from the chat. People are already asking for a part 2. I don't know how many hours would we have to go on before people are like, never talk about this again.
Well, how many hours does it go on before we're just the cabal? And the cabal meets is getting together in Discord.
We already talked about open source foundation. I mean, this panel alone has shown up for several conversations already over this past year. So,
well, all right. Well, then we're just gonna, Adam. Sorry, we're just not gonna end it. We're just gonna get this. We're gonna keep the episode open. We're just gonna keep running.
24-hour stream, baby.
24 hours exactly. We're gonna start. I'm gonna go get a catheter here, and I'm just gonna go to the distance.
All right.
I knew I could get there. That's what it took. I will again. Thank you all. We're gonna have to do it again at some point. Hopefully, no more rug pulls to come. But there's a lot of sage wisdom. I do love Ashley. I love Baby Communist Ashley, and I think I want to get the plush to all of that. So you have to let me know when that's available.
I want one too.
All right. Thank you all, and thanks everybody. We'll see you next time.